So, the tradition of the Dave Binkley Memorial Lecture began at the 2005 Access Conference in Edmonton. It was initiated by Gary Gibson of Gibson Library Connections in memory of Dave Binkley, who was one of the leading spirits in the early days of Access, and he had died earlier that year. Dave was a remarkable innovator in automated online services in his day, and it's marvelous that we are able to continue to remember him. So when Gary Gibson retired, OCLC Canada took up the mantle in 2018. So please, if you could welcome Andy Spilloe from OCLC Canada, who is here to introduce this year's Dave Binkley Memorial Lecture. Thank you so much, Andy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to introduce Jordan. Jordan is the Digital Repositories Librarian at the University of Waterloo, a community building member of the Canadian Association of Research Libraries Open Repositories Working Group, and a former community coordinator for the Maintainers. That's a place I strongly encourage you to check, a link I strongly encourage you to check out. Not too long ago, in Jordan's first semester of library school, a professor told them they didn't know what space meant when they spoke about the actual physical space of libraries. That same week, they submitted their geography thesis. Since then, they spent a lot of time thinking and writing about library spaces and logistics. Then the pandemic hit. They didn't go outside for 2 years, and their sense of space imploded. In this talk, Jordan will talk about how much more complicated and contested library space became since that awkward class discussion. So without further ado, please welcome Jordan.
Thanks so much, Andy, and thank you to OCLC and Access and everyone for joining us here today. It's a real honor to be here. Last time I came to, this is my first IRL Access, but I was very grateful to be named the third smartest goat at Access 2020 for knowing more answers to random trivia questions than all but 2 other goats. I'm grateful to be here today as a guest on unceded Algonquin lands. And this paper was composed on lands covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant by the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, and by the Williams Treaties and Treaty 13 with the Chippewas and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I live off the historical portage route known as Gete-Onagiming, now known as Davenport Road, connecting the 2 major rivers of central Toronto, the Humber and the Don. And I work at the University of Waterloo, located on the Haldimand Tract, the 6 miles on each side of the Grand River promised to the Six Nations in 1784. Centuries of broken promises later, the Six Nations control approximately 5% of what was rightfully theirs. And over the course of this talk, I do my best to connect libraries to land and think of what it means to be a respectful ally. I also acknowledge that reproductive justice and sexual health care is something extraordinarily lacking in the communities around where I work. Growing up in downtown Toronto in the late 90s, I was lucky to be able to access emergency contraception by taking a quick walk on my lunch break in high school. And I can tell you, I would not be here today if not for my access to reproductive health care. So I am donating my honorarium today to the Shore Center in Kitchener, an awesome organization committed to offering anti-racist, culturally sensitive healthcare, education, contraception, pregnancy, and abortion services. They're the maintainers of the Choice Connect app, which is a privacy-focused app that connects pregnant people to abortion providers across the country without collecting any more data than necessary to operate. And they also produce this awesome shirt I'm wearing today. So shout out to Shore. Shout out to Shore, yeah. So I'm going to begin with a story from the fall of 2014, my first semester of library school. From the one class I was taking as a part-time evening student, Introduction to LIS. We were asked to interview someone about their use of libraries, and I interviewed my mother, who spoke about requiring some staff assistance to access materials during a major library renovation. And the professor asked if any of our interview subjects spoke about space. Still an enthusiastic student back then, I raised my hand and I said, yes. We spoke about the challenges of being an adult with a physical disability, trying to access children's materials on small shelves during a branch renovation, and, oh, no, that's not what space means, she interrupted. Like community space, like social space. And I just finished my second geography degree that week. They're like, what was that for? And I sat in the back and I streamed the baseball playoffs every Wednesday night until the semester was over. Well, the World Series came first. But nearly a decade later, I'm going to tell you a meandering story about what being an erstwhile geographer has taught me about libraries. And in the spirit of my inability to take myself too seriously and my penchant for quoting the movie Airplane at inappropriate times, I welcome you to my talk entitled, A Library, What Is It? It's a big building where you access information, but that's not important right now. So fast forward 4 years, I'm in the last semester of library school, and I've fallen in love. Earlier that year, a famously antisocial senior staff member at work, who preferred to speak to as few colleagues as possible, has asked me to learn the name of one of the new hires on the library loading dock, because he didn't introduce himself, and then it felt awkward, so. He's effing awesome, and he's from Saskatoon. And he's super cute, and he's right there. I quickly learned he's the person you want handling your customs paperwork, intuitively understands linked data through the Marvel universe, and that keeping a log for couriers to sign in and out has implications for understanding the provenance of rare materials. I don't want to talk about the classist reactions of my colleagues who couldn't believe I was dating someone doing a job that only required a high school diploma, and instead focus on how much I learned about library space from him. Oh, his name's Dustin. For one of my final library school assignments, we had to write an evaluation plan for an information system. So I evaluated the impact of the massive impending library construction project on the loading dock, and by extension, the library system's logistical functions. And by that point in my MLIS, I had little faith in potential evaluators to consider the mailroom and loading dock an information system. So I began the paper with a quote from Newman from Seinfeld: when you control the mail, you control information. And for those of you who think you've heard this from me before, we collaborated on a panel with Jillian Byrne, Max Bowman, and Mike Campbell at Access 2020. So you can go back and watch that if you want. But in the end, the library renovation yielded a new entrance to the loading dock with a ceiling too low to accommodate some trucks, just like the staff could have told you. And it was then that I started to realize that libraries need to up their game when it comes to understanding physical space. Archivists are a little bit better at this, but throughout information school, I was taught by instructors whose pedigrees and disconnection from the work of cultural heritage institutions led to the over-theorizing of the work itself. We were taught to grapple with the intellectual problems, but not to do the work of solving them ourselves. This manifested in entire floors of backlogged work across a building with a large footprint on some of the most expensive real estate in the country. We like to talk about why people come to the library. We learned about third places, speaking the language of Starbucks, and how to welcome users to sit and stay by placemaking, but not of maintaining it, not of managing the space and stacks, or keeping our facilities clean and safe. I spent so long arguing that librarians and library schools need to take space seriously. But now I realize that perhaps this place versus space distinction isn't where my brain should have settled. So in this talk, I attempt to bring a bunch of different geographical dimensions to the library, thinking beyond place and space, and admittedly making things kind of messy and heavy. And I also ask my fellow credentialed librarians, particularly those within the academy, to acknowledge how destructive this cleavage between theory and practice can be when it comes to our sustainability and survival. As I mentioned, I've got 2 degrees in human geography, but it's a word I've barely uttered in the last few years. By the middle of the first year of my master's, I experienced crippling anxiety to the point where I couldn't complete individual sentences, which makes leading class discussions and writing a thesis nearly impossible. In the entirety of the second and most of the third year of my degree, which was funded for 12 months, I wrote nothing, and then pulled it all out in the 6 weeks before they were going to deregister me for taking too long. But I couldn't drop out of the program because then I'd lose my student library job. And what helped me in that moment was a staff member leaving for a librarian job at just the right time with a steady paycheck that came with a tuition waiver and health benefits. When my then manager told me about the crappy salary of $52,000, I exclaimed, "That's like $1 million," having never broken 25K in my 15 years as a working person. Now that my brain isn't overtaxed by the anxiety of existing, I'm now applying what that MA program tried to teach me back then to the world that I move through now. And it turns out I'm not a dumbass. I just needed an e-reader and large print to be any kind of scholar. And I figured that out after I graduated. So my master's core course, taught by Deb Cowan and Mark Hunter at the University of Toronto, worked from a syllabus encompassing approximately 20 geographical concepts and theoretical frameworks. And we paired up and we picked 9 of these to focus on teaching to each other. So what was a theoretical framework? Hell, I couldn't tell you at the time. My brain short-circuited whenever the word theory was invoked. Ways of seeing the world. Let's go with that. Ways of seeing libraries and other cultural heritage institutions within the world. Space. Space is geography that is measured and managed for the purposes of exploration, organization, efficiency, and optimization. By applying standardized typologies and measurements to the surface of the Earth, to interiors, to exteriors, to the skies above us, and to the core of the Earth, it can become a target for negotiation. This is mine, that is yours. That is there, but not here. And enclosed to become property for the exclusive use of some, but not others. So activities within these spaces can be governed and curtailed. Management also involves a process of conceptual abstraction up the hierarchy of an organization, leading to those at higher ranks not understanding the nuances of the work done at lower levels. For the incredible variety of library uses, collections, services, and communities we support in our increasingly complicated workplaces, it's no wonder we need to turn to space as a metaphor for understanding what goes on in libraries, but it can only provide us with a limited knowledge of what takes place therein. Space is the empty diamond printed on the baseball scorecard for you to fill in with pencil with each at-bat. Maps. For the first and only time in my life, a family connection helped me get a job. My aunt, a nurse in Vancouver, had dinner with a librarian in town for a conference that month, and he happened to have a research grant reconstructing Old Toronto from maps. She emailed me, told me to go straight up to the 5th floor of the library, ask for him, and introduce myself, then go straight home and apply for the job, and the posting closed that evening. The experience that best prepared me for this job was spending my childhood sitting on my grandparents' couch with a Toronto phone book, street atlas, and postal code directory. I'd learned the software on the job. It turns out I'm pretty bad at cartography, but pretty good at spatial analysis and data management. And that's how I got my start in libraries. But to transform the three-dimensional globe into a two-dimensional printed image, we need to get rid of all of the details. Cartography relies on processes of generalization, erasing the nuance of place to collapse into space. How does the cartographer best translate the lay of the land to a map reader? And how can maps be overlaid and read together to illuminate intersections of interest using the all-seeing bird's eye view? And how does one attempt to reconcile the various research methods of scholars who believe that the land is theirs to know everything about? Architecture schools are particularly bad at sending all of their students to the library separately, saying they'll give you all these data sets for locations far away from us, without acknowledging the fact that we didn't have them in the first place, nor the ethics or costs of collecting such data. We were just letting them down because we didn't have it. Governmental jurisdictions don't mesh with watersheds, the catchment area of health centers, the noise buffer around a logistics facility, and especially not the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. But these official frameworks are how map and geospatial data collections are organized. Collecting, combining, and managing cartographic sources is inherently messy, as seen here in a map that Sarah Simkin and I created during our undergraduate days, assisting the World Wildlife Fund with the evaluation of a GIS-based landscape conservation tool. So in this map, we see the boundaries of Parks Canada's James Bay Coastal Natural Region overlaying the ecoregions and ecozones of the National Ecological Framework for Canada. As always, merely viewing maps can tell us different things about the land or distract us from what nature is trying to tell us. Nature. Untouched, wild, awesome, undeveloped, empty, uninhabited, exotic. In fact, nature exists only in relation to capitalism after it has been measured, explored, exploited, and violently colonized. Common understandings of nature position it in contrast to industry and modernity, with populations who have lived on these lands for millennia positioned as in opposition to civilization. The proximity to nature is used to market single-family suburban homes built in car-dependent communities on underprotected greenbelt lands. Since March 2020, I've been in a group chat with 85% Californians, including Elizabeth Nikula, an artist in San Francisco who documents her relationships with the animals who visit her backyard, including a scrub jay named Frank, shown here. As someone who has lived their entire life within 10 kilometers of their present location, oh wait, no, when I was writing that, it was my present location. I've been lucky to experience respiratory challenges due to wildfires only once in my life. But my friends in California have had N95s on hand for years. My last time in an airplane, I was on the way home from a conference in Vancouver, listening to an ambient dirge about outrunning a wildfire, while that went on in reality below me. I've tried not to make my lengthy commute anyone's business, eating the costs of a car, fuel, and time spent in traffic, but I can't justify the trip to work. I increasingly cannot just justify the trip to work, let alone tack on an overseas vacation onto the other end of a conference and have work partially pick up the bill. Nature is also the name of a suite of highly prestigious academic journals, some of which charge 14,000 Canadian to the authors of accepted articles. Scale. With exploration, mapping, and colonization, and the incredible violence and cultural genocide that accompanies it, the world opens up to those who seek to explore it, causing different relationships, patterns, and power dynamics to emerge. Globalization often forces us to think simultaneously at the scale of the home, the city, the region, focusing on both the local and the global, affecting our understandings of community, industry, economy, and governance. And for those of us in the global north, we're often unaware or willfully ignorant of the forces that continue to foster uneven development. Of course, Diasporic communities understand this multi-scalar existence intimately. One cannot just turn off events happening elsewhere in one's world. I note that on the campus where I work, this month's protests and vigils for the women murdered by the Iranian state took place in front of the library that I work at. And the biggest protest gathering I saw in the province, in the Toronto suburb of Richmond Hill, flooded the grounds near the Central Library as well. Libraries are good at operating across scales and around arbitrary limits through consortia, interlibrary loan networks, and by an underappreciated open repository infrastructure to which my personal well-being is presently tethered. In the earliest weeks of the pandemic, Campus IT set up an Alibaba-based VPN to assist students who were preventing from accessing class resources by the firewalls of their home countries. At a smaller scale, if it's just random books you're looking for, you might be lucky to find a cast-off Microsoft Access for Dummies or Chicken Soup for the Vegan Soul in your local neighborhood book exchange. Of course, the Little Free Libraries organization is proud to exist at a global scale, but can unorganized independent book boxes actually fill literacy gaps that have much more to do with austerity and poverty? Forgive me if that's the one question that I have no desire to answer anymore, as I asked it once before. We went viral, fielding interview requests, hate mail, and professional support from all over the world for daring to question something so earnest and cute. Going viral is wild, and the disorientation that comes with the collapse of scale and context is something. And I'm grateful that I presented as a woman at that time. The strangest part is that I was still in library school, and a professor known for her research on public libraries rejigged her syllabus that summer to include our just published paper, which prompted fierce debates in her class that my friend was enrolled in. He texts me, he just raised his hand to let her know that one of the authors is a student in the program right now. And I email her to thank her for reading it and raising it with the class, offering to come and talk about it, or even just to learn about what was discussed. No reply. I never understood why there was such reticence to engage with the work of those outside the faculty bargaining unit. The body. This is the topic I gravitated to presenting on for reasons that I thought might clear some of the thoughts in my head. That week, I donned a chest binder in public for the first time to speak about Judith Butler and the energy required to sustain dynamic gender performances across different audiences. From the mass media, to advertising, to clinical trial participation, to accessing materials in libraries and official archives, the question of who sees themselves and their bodies represented are highly political. From the hidden corners of my elementary school library, where we read, "Where did I come from?" and "What's happening to me?" I've attempted to cultivate safe, private spaces for me to learn about my own body, whether they be at the end of a library range next to a wall, or with a VPN and a private browser window. What can we do as libraries to facilitate safety in one's own body, when simply searching for abortion and gender-affirming care might be a crime in your jurisdiction? One day, sometime before the 2019 election, I listened to an episode of the Sandy and Nora podcast, in which the hosts discussed objections to keeping politics out of the office. As someone who serves on the executive of their Librarians and Archivists Association, I've been on all sides of, should we be writing another open letter that does not explicitly have to do with our jobs as librarians? But how can I not think of my workplace, the library, as political, when this is where I was first able to recognize how much my life in this form, in this body, had value and meaning? For many of my colleagues, a number of whom had not known a trans person before, to have them actively participate in making not just my life, but the lives of fellow trans folks at Waterloo more livable, and then for them to take that activism beyond the workplace, for me to exist and do my job as an ordinary worker is political. Here today to put my body on display for you is a vulnerable, radical political act. Sometime after I finished school, I began a gender transition. And though I expected changes to happen to my physical form, what I didn't expect was all of the anxiety short-circuiting my brain to melt away. Sentence is finished. The depressed and selfish, nervous jerk leaving me. And for the first time in my life, I had courage. Imagine wearing someone else's glasses for your entire life, and after decades of living, you're finally able to articulate, describe, and care for who and what's around you. So many of the people I work with didn't know me before as someone who barely wanted to be here. I've developed the greatest friendships with coworkers who are my greatest allies. What if you could just snap your fingers and help someone be their very best self? Trans healthcare is mental health care. In the before time, I volunteered on panels of real-life queer and trans folks on campus to explain to staff just how easy it is to be welcoming of us. Believe us when we tell you who we are. That's it. Wouldn't you rather hear me talk about Star Trek in the new baked potato restaurant at the plaza? I asked the audience. Helping us live our lives enables us to do just that. In the first winter of the pandemic, I played the 2018 video game Celeste, which I'm showing here, a puzzle platform in which you play Madeline, a solo backpacker, dealing with panic and anxiety while climbing the eponymous Mount Celeste, where your aim is to survive each jump while collecting as many strawberries as possible. Madeline never dies as a result of a bad jump. She just rematerializes at the beginning of the screen with a cymbal crash. You jump, you fall, you jump, you jump, you fling yourself into the abyss. And as your comfort with the mechanics of gravity and time-space increases, the feeling of launching yourself into the void over and over gets a little less daunting. As you become more acclimatized to your body's strange movements, I'm gonna play that again. You admit that some of your footfalls might not be secure and potentially catastrophic, but YOLO. You practice each jump in sequence until it feels properly choreographed and rehearsed. Okay. It's the video game I felt most viscerally in my flesh, despite having many of the same dynamics as Super Mario Brothers, which I've been playing all my life. You just need to put your head down and survive. And if you don't get all the strawberries, that's okay. You do your best. But this video here, Madeline encounters an environment where as soon as she jumps away from the surface with these little red hairs on it, it turns into a place that can hurt her if she lands on it again. And yet sometimes she only knows how to survive by returning to these places that hurt again and again. If that isn't the perfect metaphor for queer and trans life, I don't know what is. Leaving the house for any reason these days is now something I pre-rehearse to the point of exhaustion, preparing for all of the ways something I've done so many times before can now hurt me in different ways. I am here with you today as a demonstration and manifestation of courage, having flung myself off a platform, knowing nothing can save me if I miss the strawberry. Once more onto the breach. Mobilities. More than just movement from one place to another, mobilities refers to the myriad ways, means, and reasons of getting from point A to B to C to Z and all other combinations therein. Who goes to work? Who can get to work in the first place? Who gets to travel for business, for leisure, or to be away from their families for several years at a time? For those of us staying put, how do the necessities of life get to us? Mobilities enable the global networks and luxuries we're used to, and transport and commercial deregulation penalize those living in rural and remote locations. The same provincial government that funds less and less of our university each year plows ahead with Highway 413. To connect to the highway, I spend much of my working life on. I live just over 100 kilometers from my office. In my 4 years on the job, I've seen the entire length of Highway 401 from the 427 in Toronto to Highway 8 in Kitchener, under construction, widened and widened again. I drive back and forth to work because the only public transit option would have me on the bus for the same amount of time that I would be in the office each day, and costs more per day than a month of parking. I carpool with contingent faculty from the nearby university in exchange for oboe lessons. In my first year on the job, I did this 4 or 5 times per week, and returned once a week between pandemic waves to speak to colleagues across the room on Microsoft Teams. The planned direct transit connection between Waterloo and Guelph was canceled, so that highway that connects them can be widened instead. I haven't driven to work in a while. I move my car around the block in accordance with my parking permit instead of driving 200 kilometers per day. I rarely venture more than a kilometer from my apartment, a combination of public health habit and, ultimately, agoraphobia. I have not worked from a remote location, connecting from a new climate or time zone. There are lots of places I'd like to visit someday, but understand that environmentally and epidemiologically, my personal decisions are as important as collective actions. I'm constantly asked, why don't you move closer to work? I can't afford to give up rent control to move for increased housing costs, and ask my partner to give up his career, which is, by this point, really cool. More interesting than mine. These days, Waterloo students pay more for individual rooms in shared accommodation than we do for our 2-bedroom Toronto apartment. In retrospect, I wish I stuck to my initial idea for a geography thesis, examining Canadian nationalism through end-of-broadcast day B-roll montages over the national anthem at the start and end of TV programming. Instead, I went with the only good idea I had. It turns out one can't ask the question, what's the deal with this place, like Jerry Seinfeld, when you're in grad school. I can't tell you how many tears I shed while refusing to look my supervisor in the eye while coming up with a question acceptable to the Academy. What's the deal with the Highway of Heroes, I asked, and I ultimately ended up rephrasing it in terms of landscape. So for those of you unfamiliar, the Highway of Heroes was a stretch of Highway 401 connecting Canadian Forces Base Trenton with the Office of the Chief Coroner of Ontario in Toronto, along which the remains of Canadian soldiers killed in military operations overseas were transported in a repatriation motorcade, with locals waving Canadian flags on highway overpasses above. Back then, the coroner's office was just off Yonge Street in downtown Toronto, on a side street behind police headquarters, and flag-bearing civilians and saluting uniforms welcomed their bodies home. I asked, for those witnessing the ceremony, from their cars in 401 traffic to photographs on the front page of the newspaper, what is the political effect of this temporary solemn interruption of the flows of ordinary life seen from these many viewpoints? Exactly like the genre of landscape painting, landscape theory asks us to consider the relationship between the viewer and the constructed images in their field of view and how they came to be. The rolling hills of Northumberland County, alongside semi-trucking highways, getting the goods to the people of Ontario, who stand saluting the cortege, represents a dogged Canadianness. But not as much in Mohawk territory to the east, as pictured here, where they subvert the popular understanding of the warrior along the same corridor. In contrast, the downtown coroner's office was surrounded by thousands who didn't know what was taking place. The repetition of symbols and signs throughout our visual cultures suggests to us that North American downtown landscape are full of tall buildings, grime, pollution, crime, drugs, and sex. A few blocks south of the former coroner's office, the Toronto Metropolitan University Library lies behind Zanzibar, one of the last strip clubs left on Yonge Street. Post-colonialism. On our syllabus, we read Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and concentrated on decolonization and independence movements in the Middle East and Africa. At the time, I was woefully understudied and ignorant when it came to ongoing colonialism in our midst. And yet, I am told my proposed thesis work doesn't go far enough. I have to push farther, make it more political by introducing a second case study because it doesn't stand alone. I fill out an ethics protocol for graduate research, marking my risk of methodological harm and risk to research subjects as medium and high on the low, medium, high matrix. My supervisor amends it to say low risk, low risk. If you say so, she knows better. It gets approved with no revisions requested, which I'm told is uncommon. So I take the GO train to the eastern suburbs to interview the Canadian Forces Chief Repatriation Officer during the Kandahar mission at a Tim Hortons, where we share pictures of our cats as he has a big curly mustache like my cat Pico. And then I borrow $3,000 from my grandmother to pay for the remainder of my research costs. 2 sets of flights to northern British Columbia to spend 4 days driving the Highway of Tears, asking the impossible question, who gets to occupy a highway to acknowledge lives lost to violence? I have been connected for an interview with a residential school survivor who has lost 4 members of her family. I tearfully admit to the professor I'm staying with that before we set out, I'm not qualified for any of this. How the hell did this get approved? What am I doing? I learned ghosts are real. I didn't listen to the interview recording. I don't write about any of it. I didn't know how to fight back. I didn't know how to say no. I had no idea how to ever be the student my supervisor wanted, and I should have said no to her. And now I reckon with my participation in intellectual colonialism out loud for the first time. I think of what repatriation means. Is it the reverent return of remains from an imperial occupying force? Or is it the return of cultural heritage and knowledge, the communities from whence they came, and the work that we can do beyond this return? The post in post-colonialism does not mean it's over. How about we not rush to recolonize by rushing to register for Indigenous knowledge workshops while saying we're decolonizing? How about we say no to supporting unethical research projects? Why not respect the expertise of those in our midst? Why is participation in research and having our names on important published works the most important part of our jobs? How about we don't expect to have our jobs and our power forever? In concert with indigenizing predominantly white spaces, can we ensure the sustainability of Indigenous knowledges via land back movements and environmental stewardship as well? Racial capitalism. This wasn't one of the topics discussed in our class, but I add it here because it's helped me make sense of all of the previous themes. Racial capitalism is the framework that presents these spatial logics as the natural order of things by exploiting minoritized populations in subjugated positions to maintain the status quo. From saving time and money through the convenience and service industry to intellectual property laws inhibiting the take-up of COVID-19 and other vaccinations, to the ongoing exploitation, surveillance, and securitization of foreign nationals and domestic threats alike, to all of the scholars prevented from presenting their work at conferences due to visa requirements and travel costs. There are many intersections with the work we do as librarians. I was writing this while watching the worst of all of the long-running police procedurals, Criminal Minds, which combines the longest of logical leaps with a real-time surveillance network based on thousands of data sources. Though Penelope Garcia's spatial analysis was too sophisticated for its time, this algorithmic surveillance apparatus is now absolutely a thing of the present, and academic research publishers are at its forefront. Sarah Lambdin's forthcoming book, Data Cartels, which drops next month, traces companies like Reed Elsevier, LexisNexis, and Thomson Reuters on their corporate transformation through purchasing, collecting, and creating new data points to sell to police departments, militaries, and border security agencies throughout the world. This is what a good chunk of our library budgets are invested in. I told you at the outset that this presentation might be a little overwhelming and all over the place. And I maintain that I'm not trying to argue that no one is talking about this. But I'd like to read the Goodreads synopsis of this book with the same title by Patricia Lockwood. As this urgent, genre-defying book opens, a woman who has recently been elevated to prominence for her social media posts travels around the world to meet her adoring fans. She is overwhelmed by navigating the new language and etiquette of what she terms the portal, where she grapples with an unshakable conviction that a vast chorus of voices are now dictating her thoughts. When existential threats, from climate change and economic precariousness to the rise of an unnamed dictator and an epidemic of loneliness, begins to loom, she posts her way deeper into the portal's void. An avalanche of images, details, and references accumulate to form a landscape that is post-sense, post-irony, post-everything. Are we in hell? The people of the portal ask themselves. Are we just going to keep doing this until we die? It's that last sentence that I'd like us to dwell on. Am I going to commute like this until I die? Are we going to pay to publish until we die? Will the land we work on continue to exist? Now, back to libraries. You haven't heard me talk about my job too much. I realize in addressing an audience of library technologists, you're very likely used to being hushed when you bring up inconvenient issues, like maintenance. And the community of individuals I'm addressing these thoughts to might not overlap. But this is the only chance I'll have to put these thoughts together and get them out there, though. I'm no longer employable in this field, is something I heard several times from non-white librarians of varying gender identities working in predominantly white institutions. I know this was before I became a librarian and before I myself transitioned. I've heard this phrase uttered as some of the smartest people I know keep their heads down, hoping to survive the rest of their lives in quiet despair, or as bridges are left to burn by those not willing to hear them speak inconvenient truths. I didn't understand what that meant to me until about 6 weeks ago, preparing for what I was going to say during this talk, until I found myself in the same position. Nina and Lisa, I think of you often. You give me this courage. Much to the chagrin of many of my academic library colleagues across Canada, I don't think we should automatically be considered faculty because we have a terminal degree in our field. I'm well acquainted with other academic librarians looking askance at my employer, as University of Waterloo librarians are not faculty, not unionized, and somehow that makes us the worst case scenario, the most precarious. For what it's worth, my worst case scenario employer pays me $95,000 4 years out of school, my salary having gone up nearly $30,000 since I joined the organization. You can read the frequently asked questions on our Librarians and Archivists Association website if you'd like to know more about why we recently voted to stay staff. But for me, that decision was made in solidarity with other library staff colleagues and a refusal to introduce additional power stratifications into the workplace. Our actions have been called anti-union and anti-collective, even though the question of unionization wasn't even on the table. I've been accused of being a class traitor, but I'm here to say that you cannot decolonize the library while simultaneously arguing that you deserve to have your power over others entrenched by default to make more money and tell people what to do so you can buy a house. At the 2021 New Librarians Symposium, Yoonhee Lee gave an incredible presentation entitled, "What if we were to think of ourselves as workers under racial capitalism? From the moment we enter library school, what if we were taught to understand ourselves as agents of violent and oppressive systems based on precarity and profit?" Yoonhee is also the co-author of an important open letter to the profession on the removal of the MLIS credential from librarian roles. A removal that I personally support, given that this credential, particularly at our alma mater, can be obtained without taking a single course in LIS, and is increasingly tied to be able to afford $20,000 or the equivalent on credit. She and her co-authors make the case that the loosening of credentials will disproportionately benefit white job candidates. And she and her co-authors are absolutely correct. Two things can be true at the same time. I'm feeling like the pursuit of prestige has stripped the health of our library community from the minds of many librarians, while observing that the workplace advocacy of academic librarians has served to alienate others in the same building. The same goes for tenured faculty and their attitudes towards contingent lecturers and public school workers alike. I ask librarians, why are you here? Is it the job? Is it the profile, the prestige, the vocational awe? And if you haven't yet read Fobazi Guitar, get on that. If we discuss this openly, could we distribute our loads? Could we learn how to say no instead of, oh, it's only natural, it's the library? I'm at a crossroads in my life where the conscious actions of others in my profession, the technologies we employ, but also the core values of intellectual and academic freedom, which protect the rights of white supremacists and trans-exclusionary radical feminists to speak against our survival. These conditions preclude me from continuing to exist in your world. I'm not saying these concepts should be abolished, but approached with far more nuance. Likewise, our unions and professional associations are critical to ensuring the ongoing existence of our species. But how about those members hurt by their actions? How can I do my job when the last librarian to introduce me at a conference defended his right to creepshot sex workers on their break from his office window? How can I do my job when I'm asked to better algorithmically estimate someone's gender and race based on their name, when I spent a year of my life working with a cross-campus coalition to develop an ethical equity data survey? When the real-life struggles of a department of real human beings just become fodder for librarians to write fiction with some names conveniently changed, but the person who survived a health crisis in real life dies in the book. When the library resources we build and maintain are seen as lacking compared to our ed tech colleagues, whose business models are built on collecting as much private student data as possible instead of none. How can I do my job when your labor advocacy means you can work from wherever you want, but you won't go as far as ensuring your colleagues have a safe workplace at peak pandemic? And are any of these conditions going to change? If your instincts upon hearing this are to be offended and defensive, I'm not coming for you and your job. I'm just telling you that this profession is not one I can continue to be a part of for much longer, because I can't turn my brain off and neatly partition these breaches of trust as if they don't impact my working conditions. I cannot continue to exist in universities with a mission to specialize in everything and everything and anything, and therefore offer services beyond our means. To burn out on service work, translating demands into actions on behalf of an institution that will always be seen as dropping the ball. The hard work of translating equity and inclusion rhetoric into meaningful action is rarely welcomed with sincerity, but claims that it's not enough. And those saying so are correct. It's not enough. But to be told this from above by those not putting the work in has gotten to me. I've been let down by those who seek to benefit from collective action or without putting in the work and extending the benefits to others instead of pulling the ladder up behind them. Equity, diversity, and inclusion programs with dedicated staff will not change power structures until you reckon with the pain and breaches of trust experienced by existing staff. And for me, that includes normalizing the practice of authors spending thousands of dollars to publish articles they wrote. One article processing charge is first and last month's rent on an apartment. 2 article processing charges would pay for gender-affirming surgery, not covered by insurance. But I need to be very clear here. I couldn't work with a greater team. than the Digital Initiatives crew at Waterloo. Shout out to Krista Godfrey and Allison Hitchens for their compassionate, flexible, and realistic leadership. I'll never forget going into my first performance appraisal with Krista, approximately a year into the pharmaceutical prescription that changed my life. She remarked, "You've had a tough year," to which I immediately protested, as I was the happiest I'd ever been. And at that moment, I understood how much I needed someone to acknowledge what I had been through in the office. But what is it that libraries and archives need during this time more than anything? Now that inclusion experts offer workshops on trauma-informed library work that you can take in 2 hours and consider yourself educated, I'm going to take a different approach to explaining the dynamics I find lacking. And if you so wish, you can throw yourself into 7 seasons. Oh, that's Jordan Peterson. You can throw yourself into 7 seasons of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I had the privilege of assisting my dear friend David K. Seitz, a brilliant cultural geographer now working at Harvey Mudd College, in preparing images for his forthcoming book, A Different Trek, Radical Geographies of Deep Space Nine. And I was able to read a first draft of his manuscript. It is through cultural studies traditions like the one that he writes in that give me an entry point to super heady theory by explaining them through creative examples that I'm familiar with. So he asks, what if we interpret Deep Space Nine through the lens of racial capitalism and Afrofuturist philosophy, examining violence, labor, survival, and freedom as forces that cement and destroy the hierarchies that masquerade as the natural order of things, and examine the role of trauma and grief as one of the organizational logics of life. For those of you who aren't familiar with the plot, Starfleet has moved into the emptying Cardassian space station, now tasked with overseeing the decolonization of the planet Bajor in partnership with the Bajoran militia, consisting of survivors of settler colonial violence, many of whom worked in forced labor camps and experienced militarized sexual abuse at the hands of the Cardassians. In charge is Commander Benjamin Sisko, a recently widowed father of one whose wife died at the Battle of Wolf 359, shown in this meme here. She was killed when Jean-Luc Picard was temporarily assimilated into the Borg collective and attacked our solar system. And this meme here really, by the Soy Trek podcast, really gets across the imperial, but the benign imperial saviors of Starfleet are really the ones who actually continue a lot of the violence, or maintain a lot of the violence in this world. So Sisko is an African-American man from New Orleans. He continues to experience anti-Black racism in the enlightened Star Trek future. DS9 lies at the entrance of a stable wormhole, created and maintained by wormhole aliens connecting the Alpha and Gamma quadrants. But if you ask the indigenous Bajorans, it is the celestial temple, and the prophets ensure a safe voyage for all who pass through. And the prophets have named Sisko their emissary. He's trying to raise a teenager on a posting he doesn't exactly want, has to deal with the man who killed his wife, is suddenly a major religious figure, and having to manage these pressures with new everyday relationships with someone who's lost their home and has fought for their survival since childhood, a keener new grad who has a lot to learn about working in community, someone who has lived 7 lives already across multiple bodies and genders, containing the spirit and wisdom of them all, the bartender and broker to the informal economy who cares about profit above all, his brother who hasn't heard a word of positive feedback in years, and his son, a first-generation academic. O'Brien, the guy who fixes literally everything. The PhD holder who put her career on hold for her husband's job and now teaches elementary school. The only one of his kind who is extremely lonely. A queer exile who may or may not be a spy, who can never go home. And Space Karen. DS9 is kind of a mess, and its inhabitants are traumatized. The missions, values, and hierarchies of the institutions overlap and collide on the station. The universe is a place where racialized violence is tied to the structures of everyday life, where substance dependency is weaponized against an entire people. It is a place where sex work exists. Shout out to Jake Sisko for bringing a Dabo girl home to meet his dad, the station commander. Despite Starfleet abolishing currency, profit still exists on the backs of workers, but workers of Quark's Bar unite and unionize. Living across multiple bodies and genders is normalized. People fall in love and form families with children or without. Over the course of the series, the viewer sees how much they can't live without each other. Their survival is built on their mutual liberation and care. But Jordan, this is goofy. We're not in the 24th century. We're not at war. But as Lydia Zvyagintseva reminded us in a very thoughtful and practical presentation on library pedagogy recently, for many of us, there is a war going on outside. While we wait for the next attack or the next disaster, we can still take care of one another. While you're waiting for trust to be institutionalized, enact it. This isn't such a bummer as a talk because I learned that I do hold hope. There is power in a union, and between meetings and collective agreement negotiations, there is incredible power in individual acts. The most welcomed I felt in my relatively short time at Waterloo is when individuals with power listened and asked how they could change the system when something they hadn't considered was brought to their attention. When I became a supervisor of a series of awesome young Black and brown women on their co-op terms, I learned so much about how easy it was for me to say, I am going to take the burden of work off of you today so you can take care of yourself. My friend Cecily Walker taught me so much about what she could have used as a Black librarian attempting to live and work through unending reminders of racial injustice. And I proactively offered that flexibility and empathy to my students and to others in the workplace. What can I do to help lessen your load? For so many of us listening to this right now, you have no idea how much power you have. Take on the burden of speaking up for those around you and checking in on them. Cecily describes this here in a 2020 keynote speech. I have a MP3 of her actually speaking this. Thank you.
If I could urge you to do anything as a result of this keynote, it would be to break the silence. Talk openly and often about the kinds of interpersonal struggles you're experiencing, especially if those struggles are a result of quote-unquote cultural fit or your perceived otherness. Speak up when you witness bias against your minoritized colleagues, and listen to us. Listen to us as we share these stories without explaining or justifying the treatment we've experienced. Make noise. Be heard.
Oh, I guess that's just one paragraph. That's okay. Your safety, your mental health, your confidence in your abilities are worth the effort and worth the risk. Not only will you lift your own burden by daring to speak out and speak truth to power, but the conversation you begin will also benefit others who have, I assure you, felt exactly the same or very similar to how you're feeling right now. To quote Massive Attack's Protection, the song I listened to on repeat all through high school, I'll stand in front of you, I'll take the force of the blow. We are good at expressing support for other constituencies, but so rarely for those closest to us. While you're waiting for that trust to be institutionalized, enact it yourself. Let's hear from Cecily again.
I believe the future of this profession isn't just dependent on publishers negotiating fair ebook licensing deals or staying ahead of the rapidly changing technological requirements that our patrons expect of us. Our future is also dependent on how libraries include its most vulnerable workers and how we prepare them for success. When I think of what the library of the future might look like, I not only imagine a space where patrons have open and unfettered access to the resources they need to enrich their lives, but I also dream of a world where minoritized library workers are fully supported, are well represented in library leadership roles, and never have to bear the burden of cultural isolation or questions about their cultural fit. I dream of a profession where the troublemakers continue to make good trouble, and where this good trouble causes those in the majority to acknowledge these injustices and become advocates for dismantling these systems and creating something new that benefits all of us. This good trouble will mean inconvenience, difficulty, and yes, chaos, but in the long run, it reminds us that while we may be different, our different makes it so that we can't continue to coast on a sense of fairness that only benefits the majority. We are united within this system, and it's everyone's responsibility to make it a place where we can all be successful, regardless of how that success is defined.
The last time I traveled was in October 2019 to Vancouver, a city I have very mixed feelings about. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, aka the greatest band in the world, Shut Up and Take My Money, had just released a new album, and I listened to it exclusively for a week, with the 14-minute-long closer Hollywood, a song about surviving climate disaster with your loved ones, on repeat the most. Towards the end, he sings in a grieving falsetto, "Darling, your dreams are your greatest part. I carry them with you in my heart." Or I carry them with me in my heart, yeah. The studio the song was recorded in burned down just after the album was released. I got some bad news recently, having initially survived a series of ultimately disabling incidents, and I'm continuing to work through them. So I've been off work for 6 weeks as a result. But I felt it was important to come here and talk to you today, to express to you. I'm not sure how long I can do this. Between the application upgrades I'm years behind on, the impossibility of success in a privately run knowledge creation ecosystem stacked against authors and non-commercial entities, and the messy geographies of libraries that I've explained to you today. Over the last few years, I've lost the ability to dream, because nothing ever ends. I would like to have a dream, not a goal, and work towards it, in the hopes of attaining it while I still have time. I don't think I can do that in a system based on continuously promising the impossible and saying yes, 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 without taking care of itself. I'm going to miss a lot about libraries, but I need to substantially narrow the scope of my life. And I think I might want to take a dance class. As I mentioned, I'm off work for a bit, but you can still contact me at jhale@uwaterloo.ca. I just might not get to it for a while. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Jordan. That was great. Messy geographies, messy places. Putting the geography in our workplaces, I think, was really interesting and such a marvelous way to start us off and get our brains buzzing a little bit first thing this morning. And thank you for being so vulnerable up here. It's a tricky thing to do and definitely takes courage, which you talked about. So thank you so much. So we have a question in the room, someone who wants to ask a long question, and Slido is not letting them ask a long question. So what we will do is you ask your question. I will repeat it in as well as I can so that our remote people can hear it, and then we'll get Jordan to answer it. Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah, okay, sorry, it's not that long.
No.
It's not one of those statement questions.
We're all good.
Okay, so our libraries have recently closed the free one-day access, the walk-in access for the public. First I guess due to COVID, and now for, I don't know, whatever reason. And when we recently brought this up, one of the things that was mentioned was that we've noticed during keeping it close to the public that there's pretty much no theft anymore. So apparently there was a small area, or small group of pros maybe coming in, picking up laptops and this kind of thing.
Can I stop you there so I can do the first part of the question before it leaves my brain? Okay, so the person who's asking the question has said that during COVID their library was shut down to some in-person traffic, and that it was noticed that thefts went down while that happened. First part of the question done. Second part of the question.
So I guess my question is about the balance between, good for what we think of as the core central group we're supposed to have our eye on all the time, our students, versus the broader mandate that we should have, and just the tension between, in the space between those things when we're enforcing the security of this kind of thing at the door. That's my...
Okay, I'll try my best to repeat. I may get it wrong, but luckily Jordan's in the room and heard the actual question. So the question is about balancing the use of the library space among our core users, and in this case it is an academic library, so students, and then the wider public, which we also have a mandate to serve in some way. So how do we balance those needs, and particularly around space when security could be an issue?
Now I hear that you're talking about Robarts and Gerstein. I understand that thefts have gone down, but I'm a lurker of the U of T subreddit, even though I quit 5 years ago. I can't stop reading. And the thefts continue, I hear. And I think that I think it's far more important to provide safe spaces that we all have a role in playing, in co-creating, including the people who have who are leaving their laptops, their phones, etc. out. It sucks that we can't always trust one another, but keep your personal devices on you when you go to the bathroom. I don't want to blame people. I don't really know how to answer this question, but I feel like excluding people who aren't necessarily part of the university community, they might be a researcher from another institution. I feel like creating additional security, creating additional check-in measures to enter what once was a space that one could just walk into, that is also a kind of that also introduces a kind of surveillance as well. If you are checking in to go into the building that you work in or study in, I don't think there's any wrong, I don't really know how to deal with this, but I think that the fact that security reports went down and it was just such it was so difficult to keep all of these incidents dealt with and maintained without finding the solution or the perpetrator or whatever. I don't know. It's really tough, but I feel like actually creating and keeping open the space for folks is the most important part. University Reddits are fascinating. Can't stop. Thanks.